Hello, Todd. We're beginning. Welcome, everybody. And Todd Lefko is going to start us off and welcome us to the webinar.
Thanks, Bernadine. I'm Todd Lefko, and I'm chairperson of the Russian American Business and Culture Council. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, the Museum of Russian Art, the Volga-German Institute at the University of Northern Florida, the Germanic American Institute, the Global Minnesota, the American Council on Germany, the German Chamber of Commerce, Zerkalo, the Russian Press, the Twin Cities German Immersion School, the Teachers of German in Minnesota, and the Department of German, Scandinavian, and Slavic Studies language at the University of Minnesota. We are all hyphenated Americans. And one of the outstanding groups are the Volga-Germans. And I wish to introduce now as our moderator, my favorite Volga-German, Bernadine Jocelyn. So Bernadine, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Todd. And hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining from all around the globe. We are so honored today to offer you this hour with Sam Brungardt and Dr. Brent May, both of whom are very unique expertise in the Volga-German history and the story. My name is Bernadine Jocelyn, and I'm so privileged and honored to be a member of the board of directors of the Russian American Business and Culture Council. And I myself am a Volga-German and really thrilled to bring an opportunity for all of us to hear more from Dr. May, who's a leading expert globally in this topic. He's the Dean of the Carpenter Library, Director of the Volga-German Institute at the University of North Florida, but is joining us today from St. Paul, where he's come to be with his friend and partner in All Things Volga-German, Sam Brungardt. And Dr. Maya is going to introduce Sam when we get there. We're going to begin with him. But Brent and I share a connection to one of the Volga-German villages that we're going to be hearing about today. Brent's father is a Volga-German. He grew up in Western Kansas and has degrees from a whole bunch of different universities and institutions of higher learning, including because they want to be proud and hear them themselves affiliated with him. I'm going to name them: Bethany College, George Washington University, University of Texas at Austin, and Vanderbilt University. Lots of expertise, and thank you so much, Brent, for being with us today. And I'm going to turn the program over to you.
Well, thank you, Bernadine and Todd, and thank you to the Russian American Business, Cultural, and Council for giving us this opportunity to share a little bit of information about the Volga-Germans. So I'm going to share my screen here now and bring up some prettier pictures to look at, so you don't have to look at me all day long. So anyway, this is a picture of the Volga River in southern Russia, and this is the area where the Volga-Germans settled. We have a lot of folks around the world who claim Volga-German backgrounds, and we'll talk a little bit about what makes someone a Volga-German, for example, and how we get there. In general, I'll start off by giving you a little bit of background information about the Germans in Russia, and then we'll delve into the Volga-Germans from there. Oh, hang on. There we go. All right. Are we okay, Bernadine? You can see the slides all right?
Looking good.
So not counting the Baltic Germans that you see sort of there below St. Petersburg, the Baltic Germans have been in what we might consider part of Russia for more than 1,000 years. But when Peter the Great moved the capital from Moscow to St. Petersburg, he also brought, to help him do that, a lot of Western Europeans to St. Petersburg. So at the beginning of the 1700s, there was a migration of German craftsmen, clerks, businessmen, and those sorts of folks moved into St. Petersburg as it became the burgeoning capital of the new Western-facing Russia. So that was the beginning of the 1700s. And then following, his grandson married the lady who became Catherine the Great. And she then invited more Germans to come. So if we go down to 3 o'clock, you've got the Volga-Germans down there, and they came beginning in the 1760s. That's who we're going to focus on today. But there are also other German ethnic groups that lived in Russia as well. If we continue down to the Black Sea area at 6 o'clock, you've got a whole group of people who answered an invitation of Catherine the Great's grandson, beginning in the early 1800s, to move to the Black Sea area. And if you're one of those folks, you most likely affiliate with one of the smaller clusters of people there, from the Glickstall colonies or the Liebenthal colonies, the Kuchergan colonies, in that area, the Crimean colonies. So that group came at the beginning of the 1800s, and then beginning in the 1860s, with the emancipation of the serfs, the Russian nobles were looking for more workers to come to work where the serfs had been, and they invited more Germans to come, and they began flooding into the Volhynian area, which today is sort of split between southern Poland and Ukraine, and moving in there. And that migration into that area continued all the way up until the revolution, almost, to where you had Germans moving in there. So there are a lot of different German groups in Russia who have a history in Russia, and we're just going to be talking about the one of them, which is the Volga-Germans today. And that group came from southwestern Germany, primarily from Hessen and the Palatinate. And you can see back, if you recall, back in the 1760s, there was no Germany. Germany was made up of what you would have a bunch of electorates from the Holy Roman Empire, and a lot of different independent principalities and duchies and things like that. So this is the area that they came from, and they were moving to Russia following the end of, or at the very tail end of, the 7 Years' War. So that was sort of their impetus for moving out of Germany, was leaving behind all of the issues that came with all of the wars that had been happening in that part of the world. So very, very quickly, we'll do a little overview. Catherine the Great issued 2 manifestos, the second one on the 22nd of July in 1763, less than a year after her coronation, inviting Western Europeans, mostly Germans, to come to Russia. In all, there were over 30,000 of them that answered this call. They founded 106 colonies along the Volga River, which you've got on the map there on the left-hand side. In Volga-German dialect, we talk about the Bergseite, which is the western side of the river, and the Wiesenseite, which is the eastern side of the river. So those are some lingo that we use in Volga-German speak to talk about the areas of the Volga region where they were. The first colony was founded on the 29th of June in 1764. So we are just now coming up on soon on the 260th anniversary of the founding of the first colony there. Pobachnaya was founded by a group of kind of straggler colonists that came in 1773, but most of them came between 64 and 67. Okay, so this is a map of what became the autonomous Volga-German Republic, which existed from 1924 to 1941. That kind of gives you a good map of that area. This area is actually not very big. It's 125 miles square, about 10 million acres, about the size of Vermont. It's, you know, Russia is just a massive country, and so this area is actually pretty small. You know, driving 125 miles in Minnesota doesn't take very long, as long as it's not rush hour in Minneapolis, but you'll get there pretty quickly. Now, traveling in this part of the country in Russia takes a lot longer than that. But this gives you a feel for that, the size of the area that we're talking about. The Volga-Germans created a very prosperous part of Russia at that time. These are a couple of pictures of the city of Katrinenstadt, which had at its peak when the Volga-Germans were there, around 15,000, 16,000 people were there. Things were built in very German style. All the streets, you know, ran straight, and the yards were kept clean and things. So when Russian academics were going through the area, they always commented on the fact that these villages were obviously not Russian villages, they would say. just by the way they were arranged and the way that the people conducted their lives in them. These are just some pictures of some of the architecture that we have in the Volga region. On the left is the Reformed Church in Norka. The organ there in the picture was brought from Germany. For example, we've been able to work with the manufacturer of that exact organ and have obtained blueprints for that organ from the manufacturer in Germany. So you can see today even what that used to look like. The center one there is the Cathedral of Holy Trinity in Katharinenstadt. And then on the right of that, the right picture is an interior shot. These are a couple of other churches. They were the largest structures that the Volga-Germans built. The Catholic Church in Herzog on the left and the Lutheran Church in Dinkel on the right, which was the largest of the church structures on the Volga. Built in the late 1890s in response to some funding that was offered by the Tsar's government for the construction of public facilities in rural locations. So the Volga-Germans built churches. There was a lot of industry in the Volga-German area as well, mostly focused around agriculture. So here we have the Reinecke mill in Saratov, the Bauer mill in Sarepta, which was a little farther south in the Volga-German region. A lot of milling took place in that area. Another thing that they made, which I don't have a slide of here though, was it became a cloth manufacturing part of the world. For some cotton that was brought in from the southern parts of Russia into this area and milled in the Volga-German region. Many of the colonies had large mills by the time we got to 1900 that were making a lot of the cloth that was used in Russia as well at that time. But this whole area, much like the Ukraine is spoken of as the breadbasket of Russia, the Volga region during its height was also a breadbasket area for Russia. Huge amounts of grain went out from this area to feed the rest of the country. Here on the left, we have the Burrell mill in Saratov that was built in the 1880s. This building has now been converted into loft apartments, so it's actually still standing. The Norka Church on the right, built in 1880, large structures for religious purposes as well. So this whole enterprise of the Volga-Germans came to a screeching halt when Hitler invaded Russia in June of 1941. The Russians had been working on ways of managing the Germans that lived within the Russian Empire at that time, but this sort of gave them a reason to really act quickly. And they passed a declaration then, an ukaz, that all of the German villages were to be liquidated and the people were to be sent to the east for their safekeeping. And that was published in the Volga-German newspapers in German on the 28th of August in 1941, and on that very same day, the first train started rolling from that area eastward. This is a picture of Mikhail Kalinin, who was the head of the chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet at that time. In all, there were 451,000, almost 52,000 Volga-Germans that were deported from the Volga region to Siberia and Central Asia by the end of September. So less than a month it took them to vacate all of the villages of this area. And by this time, there were about 350 villages in the Volga region. The deportation began on the 28th of August. There were 188 trains that departed from 31 rail stations. The map on the left side there shows you the various rail stations in the Volga region at that time, and took approximately 7,600 train cars to move these people. There were 20,000 NKVD troops involved in rounding up the people and moving them all to Siberia and northern Kazakhstan at that time. And if you think about it, that's a pretty large effort on behalf of the Soviet government at that time, when those troops and those trains and those things could have been used to fight the Nazis, but instead they were used to round up the Germans that at this point had been living there for 177 years, and sent them then to over the Urals to Siberia and that area. So in general, this brought an end to the cultural history, the geographically defined cultural history of the Volga-Germans. So the first village was founded on the 29th of June in 64, and the declaration that dissolved them all was signed on the 28th of August in 1941. All of these different things are some of the things I've listed that make up culture, you know, from the language that you speak, the songs you sing, your faith practices, your agricultural practices, the way you build your buildings, the clothing styles. And a lot of that for the Volga-Germans had been integrated. They'd adapted and adopted different things from the local Russian culture as well into there. And Sam in a little bit is going to talk about how some of the food things, that happened with the food things as well. But so that's one of the things I think that's fascinating and why I find it interesting to study these folks. It's just a little slice, a little sliver of the German diaspora around the world that involves a set of people that lived in pretty much isolated area for 177 years. They then took these various things, these different pieces of their culture with them as they moved around the globe. So immigration out of the Volga region started in the 1870s. So 110 years after they had been there, they began moving to other parts of the world once the universal conscription law took effect in 1874.
Something's happened to the audio and we're trying to correct it at the moment. I don't know whether the Zoom is having a difficulty, but we are resolving it.
It looks like Dr. Mai dropped off the call. There we go.
Did I come back?
Yes.
Yes, thankfully.
All right. Yeah, the internet connection just went off. So we're back again. All right, my apologies. We'll get us back here where we were. All right, are we still up? No.
You're up, you're good.
I'm good?
Yes, sir.
I don't
We still
see you
need
guys
to.
on
We
my
still need to see the screen.
All right, there we'll do that.
Screen share.
All right. All right.
There it is.
Are we back?
Yeah.
Okay. We love technology. I need to just say nice things, huh? So keep it all going good. The ethnic Germans then began to be able to move around more freely beginning in March of 1955. And then in December of 55, they were actually released from the special settlements, more or less officially. But of course, if those of you who know the way the Soviet Union worked, just because you could move around didn't mean you actually could, because you wouldn't have a job anywhere that you went necessarily. So, but beginning in 1956, a number of the ethnic Germans, particularly the older ones, the people who were retired by that time, began moving back to the Volga region. There were some restrictions on that movement and restrictions on where they could live and things like that. But in general, movement began back then. And in 1972, all the restrictions on the ethnic Germans were removed. So if you think about it, that's, 30 years is a long time to have restrictions on what it is you can do to a particular ethnic group. Today, there are about 12,000, between 12 and 20,000, depending on who you're talking to. Germans have moved back to the Saratov Oblast. And they're not all Volga-Germans historically. Some folks that have moved to that area come from the St. Petersburg Germans or from the Odessa Germans or from the Volhynian Germans, but they have a very large cultural organization in Engels across the river from Saratov. And they're very active in trying to keep the German language alive, music and singing and cooking and things like that. So there's an active cultural group that's there, but it's nothing like it had been back in before 1941. So there are a couple of interesting things that had a big impact on this region and what you can see today of the Volga-German colonies. In 1961, they completed the construction of the Volgograd Dam. It's not a very big dam like we would think of here in the Western United States, for example, kind of low and shallow, but the land is so flat here that it backs up the river for 335 miles. The Volga now at its widest is a little over 10 miles wide. You can see here in the picture on the right is a satellite image of the reservoir that's created by this very shallow dam that they have just north of Volgograd. The impact that had on some of the colonies, they were inundated by the river, particularly those on the Wiesenseite. So you can see in the map on the right-hand side, the bigger picture of the curve of the Volga River as it comes through there today. And you can see on the left-hand picture where the villages used to live, used to be located. And then in the late 50s, they relocated the colonies of Preuss and Heusel up onto the bluff above the river, and that's where they are today. So sometimes I'll have people who say, when I give them the coordinates for their village, they'll say that, oh, well, it's in the middle of a river, so that can't be where it is. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's where it is today. So anyway, that's just one of the interesting things that has happened to this area since then. This is just a look at some of the ruins that are visible in the region. This is the Reformed Church in Messer, which was built in 1912. Believe it or not, one of the oldest structures is the ruins of the church in Dobrinka, which was built in the early 1800s. The church in Schaffhausen is the oldest one standing in 1832, and it's just a shell. Schaefer was built in 1906, Marienburg Catholic Church in 1877. The church in Zeilmann is no longer there, but the chapel in the cemetery, what used to be the old German cemetery, is still there, and you can see some of the ornate craftsmanship and work that went into these structures that were built out there on the steppe. This is the Marienburg Catholic Church. I mentioned it before. Most of these structures today are being used because the colonies are no longer there. They've been used by the local agricultural collectives during the Soviet era, and now most of them are just falling into ruins, but you can still see some of the artwork on the walls here in Marienburg, for example, and also what used to be St. Mary's Catholic Church in Kamenka as well. Now the photographs that I took here of the frescoes there are no longer visible at all. because the roof in the church that's shown there on the right completely collapsed, and it was completely open to the elements. So those frescoes are no longer visible on the inside there in Kamenka. But there were some pretty impressive structures built out in that area. This is the Lutheran Church in Rosenheim, built in 1886. Bricks that were manufactured there in the colonies themselves. This is the Lutheran Church in Gnadenthal, was constructed in 1888. It was rehabilitated in the 1990s in an effort funded by the German government in an effort to keep some of the Volga-Germans in Russia instead of having them come back to Germany, which is what they've been doing in large part since 1990. This is one of the more impressive restorations that's happened. We saw earlier the church in Kathrinenstadt was built in 1851. During the Soviet era, it was used as a Dom Kultura, the house of culture, the community center, so to speak, for the village there. Today, Kathrinenstadt goes by the name of Marx. And that church, Holy Trinity, has been completely rehabbed by funding from a local Volga-German who runs the Saratov Bank. And he's paid for the reconstruction of the steeple, and the interior has been renovated as well, and the new cross and a gold dome on the top of the steeple as well. So that's kind of an interesting one to see. Another one is Christ Lutheran Church in Zurich, has also been rehabilitated. The blueprints for that church still exist in one of the archives there. It was built originally in 1877. In 1990, it was renovated and used as a cultural center, but there was a fire there in 2008, which destroyed the interior of the building. And that has now been completely rebuilt and dedicated in 2015. And that entire project was funded by the grandson of one of the original construction workers there at the church, Carl Lohr, and we'll see his photo in a little bit as well. But that's sort of the upper right-hand picture, I think, gives you a good example of what these colonies sort of looked like back in the day, with these huge churches kind of looming over these rural communities. So that's kind of interesting. That photo up in the upper right is looking from the east to the west. So you're looking across the Volga River there to the bluffs on the west side of the West Bank. So where are the Volga-Germans today? These are just some of the locations where we have a significant number of Volga-Germans. In general speak, about 2 million of them have moved back to Germany since 1990. There are about 1.5 million in Argentina of descendants of Volga-Germans, about 500 or 400,000 in Brazil, and we have about 4 million in the United States and Canada. And those are pretty conservative numbers. And yes, that does count all of those who are from mixed backgrounds. My mother, for example, is Swedish, so I get to be a half Volga-German here. We also have a group that settled in Australia and another group that settled in South Africa. So they are generally speaking all over the place. And so the languages that one finds the research of the Volga-Germans in is also comes in German, Russian. A lot of the old stuff is in French, English, Spanish, Portuguese as well. I'm not aware that there is anything in Afrikaans. So that's the one maybe that we haven't had too much publishing on. I've just thrown out some people here that some of you might be familiar with. For those of you who've been in the pandemic, if you've watched The Tiger King, believe it or not, that guy is a Volga-German. You know, he falls into the infamous category. Sergio Denis in Argentina, his real name was Hector Hoffman, which sounds better for a German. He's sort of a crooner in the Argentinian world. So he just passed away recently as well. Christine Weitz in the United States is a country pop singer from the West Coast. Helene Fischer in Germany is a very popular artist there as well. These are, you know, hometown names for people around the country. These guys are all in Argentina. These are famous soccer players, and Argentina has a couple of colonies down there that have just put out an enormous number of very famous Argentinian soccer players, and these guys play for teams all around the world. So if you live in Argentina, these are household names for soccer fans as well. Back here in the United States, we've had a number of them who have been involved in politics as well. Jim Geringer was the governor of Wyoming for a number of years. We've had people in the Massachusetts and Montana Senates, a couple of important judges around the country, and I'm always finding more of these kind of people as well. Lawton serves as the Chief Justice of the Kansas Supreme Court right now. So there are, if people are aware of more of these kinds of things, I welcome you to send me information about them so that I can share that information with our broader community as well. We have some famous business people as well. The Schmick in McCormick and Schmicks is a Volga-German. Doug comes from the colony of Jagodnaya Poljana. Philip Anschutz, who's one of the wealthiest people in the United States as well. He funds a lot of things in Colorado, including the medical center there at the university. And his ancestors come from Niedermanju. John Wirtz is a little closer here to Minnesota. He's over in Michigan. That's the battery manufacturers, Wirtz and Company. Michael Michaelis is at the Enterprise Bank in Wichita and Kansas area. And then you have a picture in the lower right-hand corner of Carl Lohr. He's the big industrialist construction magnate. His headquarters not in the Volga region, but he does a lot of construction in Russia, and very well known in that area for the Russian world. And not to leave out somebody that you might find a little more regional here. Culver's is a Volga-German company. So Mrs. Culver's family comes from the colony of Husenbach. So we'll claim them. We're getting our first Culver's in Jacksonville now, so we're excited about that. We'll have Volga-German cheese curds, I guess we'll say. Anyway, this is sort of a really broad introduction to the Volga-German culture and where we are, who we are, what we are, where we are, that sort of thing. You will find a lot more information at the volga.domains.unf.edu website, including a lot more biographies, a lot more photographs, information about immigration, and particularly a lot of interactive maps that deal with migration from Germany to Russia and to the rest of the world. And I encourage you to check that out and send me questions about that as you might have them. All right, so I am going to now introduce Sam, and he's going to tell us a little bit here about some of our foodways. Are we doing okay on our time? And yes. How that's all integrated. And Sam is someone I've known for a number of years. Let's bring Sam into our picture here. All right, here we have Sam. We're at Sam's house. He has a gorgeous home here, a craftsman style dining room, which is fantastic. And I thank him for sharing that with us today. Sam is originally from Ellis County, Kansas, from the Volga-German community there. And whenever I have questions about foodways and things like that, Sam is my go-to guy for answering questions about Volga-German food and house practices and things like that. And he's a good cook, so I can smell all this stuff here. I'm sorry that you guys can't do that, but it's actually very wonderful here. So I'm going to pass this off to Sam, and he's going to tell us a little bit about what he's got to look at here. All right.
Okay. Thank you, Brent. there. It's wonderful to be able to visit with you today. And just to put a little bit more on my background, I was raised down in West Central Kansas, and the county that I was raised in was essentially one settled by Catholic Volga-Germans, which really only comprised about 1/3 of the Volga-German population. Right next door, where Brent has relatives, is Russell County, and that is all mostly Reformed and Lutheran. And so we're real regional, and we tended to settle by people that we knew when we moved into the Prairie region. And of course, all of us had a background in raising wheat, and that area of Kansas is really important to the United States wheat production. So, and a lot of the people bought land from the railroads. When they were building the railroads, the government helped finance the building of the railroads by giving land grants or land to the railroads that it could sell to immigrants and rent to immigrants too. So what we're going to do is I just wanted to go ahead and, if I could, talk to you just a little bit about what we have to thank Russia for in the Volga-German cuisine, or our cooking ways. And the very first thing that came to mind was something that's dear to every Volga-German's heart, and this is Nadik, or it would be known in Russia, or simply watermelon honey. And I don't know if any of you are acquainted with this, but in the area around Saratov, it would have been very, very famous because a lot of watermelons are grown there, and farther south in Russia as well. But when folks didn't have much money, and before white sugar was readily available, and before the sugar beets really had started to become a commercial crop in Russia, this was what people used to sweeten things. And so you'll find it used, and later on I'll bring over a kuchen that I just made, Volga-German style. But this is an example of the buns that my grandmother used to make. And they're flavored with watermelon syrup. My grandmother just used black pepper in them. They're sweet and kind of hot to the taste. You want to eat them with a lot of butter. But other people sometimes put anise in them, and star anise, things like that to give them flavor, allspice sometimes. And I've even talked to a few people who said, well, the grandkids don't like any of those spices, so I just put the watermelon syrup in them, and they like them like that. So it also makes wonderful, wonderful kuchen. Another thing that the Volga-Germans, and I don't know how familiar they were with it in Germany or in Western Europe, but that is licorice root. And it was readily available for the digging in the Volga colonies. And so this happens to be an example of a Volga-German pickles that I put up. And they're actually flavored with licorice root, so you've got a dill pickle, very nice, but then at the end, when you get done eating it, all of a sudden you get this little explosion of sweetness, and it's from the licorice root. Volga-Germans also used licorice as a morning drink. They had licorice tea that they called it. And I think they actually usually put also some other herbs that they picked out in the wild on the steppe or on the hillsides. Okay, then moving into something more substantial, and I tried a new recipe for some dough, and I asked my partner, how did it taste? And he says, well, I haven't gotten to the good part, the filling yet. He says, I've been eating a lot of dough. This is an example of a foodstuff, a Volga-German foodstuff that actually has a adopted Russian name. This is a birok, or which the Volga-Germans picked up from pirog, of course, in the Russian. It's not a large pie. This one turned out about the size I like them. And it is usually filled with things like sauteed cabbage and onion. And in this case, it has chopped or hamburger in it and some garlic, salt, and pepper. And that's the filling, and some sauerkraut just to give a little tang. So these are extremely popular here in the United States. And sometimes if you're going through Nebraska, perhaps, or even Colorado, and some places in Kansas, you'll see a runza restaurant. And a runza just is another word for birok, but it also means a little satchel or a belly. So it's kind of descriptive for these things. Very popular. And then I guess the other thing I was going to do was, and in fact, it's time to take it out. I'm gonna just step over here and I'll go get it.
I'll tell you a little bit more about the runza, the biroks, and that sort of thing. The little town I grew up in western Kansas, not far from where Sam grew up, we had so many Volga-Germans there that's what they served at the cafeteria at the school. So, you know, it was just an everyday thing there. And you have family disputes that break out over what you actually put in the birok. You know, does it have cabbage in it or sauerkraut? And is the cabbage going to be yellow cabbage or red cabbage? Are you going to use hamburger, or are you going to use sausage, or are you one of the purists that doesn't put meat in it at all? You know, or are you really sacrilegious and put cheese in there? You know, so it's one of those things that over the years we've added in some other elements to from the local cuisine into what it is that Volga-Germans eat. But you will find, and mine, for example, Sam's here are kind of crescent-shaped ones. My grandmother's were always square. So, you know, you have those kind of variances that go on too. But you will find a version of birok in all of the Volga-German communities around the world. Still, even the ones coming from Siberia and Kazakhstan today, moving to Germany, will have a version of this as well. All right, Sam is here now.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. And I guess once you're a Volga-German, you're always a Volga-German, and this is a typical Volga-German cherry kuchen. And basically it has a sweet rolled base. And onto that also is, of course, the cherries that are tart cherries that have been sweetened and thickened with some thickening, and that's spread over the base. And then on top is what we call grimmel, or I'm sorry, I'll think of it in a minute.
Yeah.
It's a kind of streusel
Strudel, yeah.
that goes on top,
Strudel.
and it provides some crunch, and then you hit that nice, delicious fruit filling. And then on the bottom is the bread, which granted isn't quite as good, but hey, it can't all be something good. So I got mostly my interest. The other thing I want to mention is something you folks might be acquainted with. It's black nightshade, or pozlan cherny, I think is what it's pronounced. Can you help me there? Okay. That's an example of the berries. They grow wild in Russia, in the Volga region. And not too many fruits do very well there because of the very extremes in climate. It tends to have a lot of droughts, and also the winters are very, very cold, or can be very, very cold. So this was a wild plant that the Volga-Germans came to really, really value, and used them in, you can make kuchen with them, or you can go ahead and make filled, sort of like a vareniki. And they're filled with sweetened, these berries, and then you boil them, drain them really well, and then my mother used to cook down butter and cream together, sometimes sweet cream, sometimes sour cream. And this was served over the top of them. So it's really, really good. But you sort of have to grow up with them to like them a lot. I think those are one of the things I've done is my first foray into really exploring maybe what the Russians and Volga-Germans had in common was a cookbook that I edited for the North Star chapter, the Germans from Russia. And this is available on the AHSGR website. And then much of my resource material, unfortunately, my grandmother had died, and so had most of my great aunts who came from Russia to Kansas. And most of my material in trying to learn more about that period is adapted from this German book by Lonsinger, which is an excellent, excellent resource. He not only talks about the foodstuffs, and I think it's, if a memory serves me right, it's the material folk culture of the Volga-Germans. And this was published maybe 20 years ago in Germany.
It's in German.
Yeah, and it is in German, and very, very good. It not only talks about foodstuffs, it all talks about ways of dressing and how the villages were designed and everything laid out in the platted and everything. Extremely good resource material. So I don't know, Brett, I think I've bored these folks enough, so.
Not at all. Thank you so much, Sam. That was fantastic. And we wish the smells could come through. We're
I
gonna,
wish they could.
our audience is enthralled, and we have a lot of comments and questions. And in the last 10 minutes here, if you guys are open to it, we'll go ahead and pose those to you. And the first one, Sam, since I'm going to give a question from one of our listeners to you, is about that licorice root that you talked
Yes.
about.
Mhm.
Where do you get that?
Actually, here in the United States, I buy it here in a health food store or in some place like a food co-op, and you can get it in two different forms. One is the root is maybe a piece about this long, and it looks like a dried branch or a dried root. And you can also buy it as in a chopped form too.
Mm-hmm.
So all you need to make a licorice tea is a lot of hot water poured over it, wait a few minutes, and it's quite strong tasting, actually.
Thank you so
It's
much.
very
And
flavorful. Yeah, it's
yeah,
good if
and
you're used to it. Yeah.
it's great that you guys have that connection from your childhood in Kansas as well. Dr. May, the next question is for you. Walter Mannings, who is with us today, asked a great question. Tell us, please, about why you study Volga-Germans, beyond your own personal connection. What is it about their story that has interested you your whole life?
What's the
That was
question?
for you.
I can't hear it.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No,
I
that's
am
for
so
you,
sorry.
Brent.
Sorry.
Sorry.
What was it?
Brent, there you go. That was a question for you, Brent.
And what was the
Walter
question?
Manning, Walter Manning is asking, please tell us why you study Volga-Germans. What is it about their story that has so captured you?
I think a part of it that to me is fascinating is that these people, and I showed you where they had migrated to all over the world, it's how they then over history can look at the same issues from all these different perspectives. If you think about it, the Volga-Germans have a particular perspective on the 7 Years' War, all the way back to the beginning. They have a particular perspective on Russian industrialization, on the revolution in Russia, on the impact of Sputnik, for example, on agricultural production. And each one of these groups that moved out from the Volga region to other parts of the world would find themselves on different sides of issues and understanding and language and literature and that sort of thing. But yet we all share a commonness on having had this 177-year geographically defined cultural history that's along the Volga River in Russia, in a very isolated little location, and yet you've got people all over the world that share that history, but have a different, so it's to me, that's all fascinating, that you can have one common shared history and very different views of it from around the world. And it's a unique little, like I said, a slice of the German diaspora. There are lots of Germans all over the world.
Well,
but this is a particularly little interesting angle.
And today, with us here today, right now on this webinar, we have people from the United Arab Emirates, from Moscow, from the UK, from all over the US. So that's absolutely true that we're connected. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of rapid fire. We have some really fascinating questions. Brent, what about intermarriage with Russians? Talk to us about that.
Intermarriage with Russians, very little of that up until the revolution in 1917. Then there was a little bit more of that as other ethnic. This group actually was pretty isolated ethnically as well. There weren't a lot of other folks living in this region. The deportation in 1941, though, threw all of that up in the air. And as they found themselves then in Siberia and Kazakhstan and things, and much more likely to intermarry with other people in the local population. But then you go to places like where I grew up and where Sam grew up, and you still have Volga-Germans marrying Volga-Germans. So, and even in Germany today, some of the folks coming from Siberia, are we still on, or did we get lost?
No, you're good.
Are we still? We're good?
Yes, you're good.
Even today, Volga-Germans coming from Kazakhstan and coming from Altai Krai are marrying each other. So there still is a seeking of a common past that brings people together. So
yeah, thank you. So Alice Smith, who's with us today, has a grandmother who told stories to her, and she's wondering. One of her grandmother's memories was being on a sled as they left the Volga to go to the US on the Volga River when it was frozen. And then she has another memory or a story about her grandmother's brother sleeping on a stove. What do we know, Brent, about the experience, the immigration experience from the Volga? How did they get then to the US? And what was that like when they left?
Immigration to the United States started in 1874, and they came mostly by train from the Volga region. But then what Alice's grandmother would be talking about is how she got to the train.
Yes.
By sled. As the Russians have done for centuries, the frozen rivers are often a highway during the winter time, so that may very well have been a way that they traveled there. Folks still have sleds in that area. There are a lot of horse-drawn vehicles as well still today, but they would have come then by train through the train lines at that particular point. Didn't all go through Moscow. Some of them went a little bit north of that, and they would go to the ports in the Baltic or to Hamburg or Bremen. And from there, then they sailed, some to England first, where they then switched over to an American-bound ship, or others directly from Hamburg to New York, Boston, Maine, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and then by train from there out to the prairies of Kansas, Nebraska, Saskatchewan, Alberta, just like they had left when they were in Russia. Similarly, in Argentina, they went to the steppes down there, and they settled in the same kind of areas in Australia as well.
Thank you, Brent. Someone was asking if maybe Sam, if you could type into the chat box again, please, the title of that German book. People are interested. And then Brent, to you a question. People are asking about research for their own genealogy.
You put the title.
What organizations
of course
are helpful?
Don't put the type. Can you type it in?
Yeah, type it in. For people who want to do their All
right, we got Sam going here. For the Volga-Germans, the primary association in the United States is the American Historical Society of Germans from Russia, that's headquartered in Lincoln, Nebraska. They also have members that are Black Sea Germans and Volhynian Germans as well, but the bulk of them are Volga-Germans. The other group would be the Germans from Russia Heritage Society, which is headquartered in Bismarck, North Dakota. And their primary focus group is the Black Sea Germans, but they also have some Volga-Germans and Volhynians and things like that in them. If you're into Volhynian research, the best group is in Canada. And I can provide more information if people are interested in that. Just drop me a line.
Well, that's very generous of you. And I'll share with the audience that Brent and I actually met when I was a diplomat living and working at our U.S. Embassy in Moscow, and I had an opportunity to travel to Saratov. That was still during the Soviet times. And Brent in that day had made connections with Igor Pleve, who was a researcher. I don't know if Igor's still alive, Brent, but he was one of the early researchers who went into the archives and with Brent's help have now created this astonishing database. And I really do commend, I dropped it into the chat, that you check out the maps that Brent shared with us. We've just got one final minute to go, and I want to thank you on behalf of your audience. We had almost 200 people join us here today, you guys. It was tremendous. And I'm going to give it back to our fearless leader, Todd Lefko, for some final announcements. And thank you again for being with us. Todd?
Thank you. Thank you very much to Bernadine and to Sam and to Brent. The only problem was that I could have gone for another hour listening, because there were a number of questions that weren't answered, and I feel badly about that. And so please contact us, and we'll put you in contact with Brent, or if you don't have Brent's contact, contact us and we'll do it. We have another program coming up on Central Asia on June 16th, and the announcements will go out in the next couple of days on that. And that'll be another outstanding panel of people who are experts in this area. We wish to thank all of our co-sponsors again, and especially for those of you who, whether it's the idea of coming from your background or the idea of learning about the subject, we thank you for being here. We hope you have a good day, and we look forward to seeing you again in one of our future programs. So thank you, and have a good day. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.